They say that if you sit in total silence for long enough, your brain starts to invent sounds just to keep itself sane. They call it the hum of the void. But in this house, the silence doesn't need to invent anything. It waits, it listens, and then it gives back what you've lost. My name is Elodie, and I've just moved into a place where the echoes don't belong to the rooms. They belong to the people who are no longer in them. The drive up the pass had been grueling. The road was a ribbon of gray gravel winding through trees so thick they seemed to swallow the sunlight. By the time I reached the iron gates, the mist had settled into the valley like a cold blanket. The house sat on the ridge, a silhouette of sharp angles and darkened glass. It looked less like a home and more like an observer, watching the road, watching the trees, watching me. I didn't want to be here, not really. But when a house is left to you and a will from a relative you've never met, and your bank account is a string of zeros, you don't ask questions. You pack your life into a few cardboard boxers and you drive. I stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching under my boots. It was a normal sound. A comforting sound. At least, it was until I stopped walking and the sound of the crunching continued for 2 more steps. I froze, my hand still gripping the car door. I looked down at my feet. I wasn't moving. But the sound of a heavy boot hitting gravel crunch crunch rang out clearly in the cool air, stopping right behind my left shoulder. I spun around, expecting to see a neighbor or a caretaker. There was only the mist. No footprints but mine. No movement but the swaying of the pines. My breath hitched, a small, jagged puff of white in the cold. I told myself it was an echo. The valley was shaped like a bowl. Sound probably bounced off the rock faces in strange ways. I pulled my coat tighter, a simple tan trench coat, nothing like the formal blazers I used to wear in the city. I grabbed my first box and headed for the porch. The wooden stairs groaned under my weight. Creak. I waited. 3 seconds later, the house answered with a creak of its own. But from the opposite end of the porch, "Hello," I called out. My voice felt thin, easily swallowed by the fog. I waited for the reply. I expected the valley to bounce the word back to me. Instead, there was nothing. No echo, no vibration. Just a flat, dead silence that felt heavy against my skin. I fumbled with the skeleton key, the cold metal biting into my palm. The lock was stiff, resisting me, until suddenly it turned with a wet, heavy thud that sounded like a heartbeat. I stepped into the foyer. The air inside was different still, dry and smelling faintly of dried lavender and something metallic, like an old coin. I set the box down on a dust-covered bench. I counted 1, 2, 3. The sound of the box hitting the wood finally filled the room. It was delayed, yes, but it was also ... deeper. As if the box I had dropped was much heavier than the one I was actually carrying. I walked through the ground floor, tracing the outlines of furniture draped in white sheets. They looked like ghosts huddled in the corners, waiting for the party to start. Every movement I made was followed by its ghostly audio twin a few seconds later. I'd reach for a doorknob, and the sound of the metal turning would happen only after I'd already entered the room. It was disorienting, like watching a movie where the audio was out of sync. I found the kitchen at the back of the house. It was a cavernous room with a black and white tiled floor and a heavy oak table. I decided to make tea, something to ground myself. I turned the brass knob on the sink. The water began to flow, clear and steaming. I watched it swirl down the drain. I turned the knob off. The water stopped. I stood there in the silence, waiting for the sound of the rushing water to catch up to the reality of the room. I waited 5 seconds, 10, 20. The sound of the water didn't come. I frowned, leaning closer to the faucet. Just as I was about to turn the handle again, the sound erupted, but it wasn't the sound of a sink. It was the sound of a torrential downpour, a violent rushing of water as if a dam had broken inside the walls. And then, through the roar of the phantom water, I heard the distinct, unmistakable sound of a woman humming a lullaby. The humming was low, a vibration more than a melody. It felt like it was coming from inside the floorboards, or perhaps from the very pipes I had just been staring at. It was a gentle, motherly sound, yet it sent a shiver down my spine that settled deep in my marrow. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I waited for the sound to fade, but it only grew more insistent, swirling around the kitchen like a physical mist. I reached out and touched the oak table to steady myself. The wood was cold and naturally so. In my head, I began to count. I wanted to see if the humming followed the same 3-second roll as the other sounds. 1, 2, 3. But the humming didn't stop or restart. It was constant. It was a live feed of a sound that shouldn't exist. Is someone there? I asked. My voice felt small, like a pebble dropped into a deep, dark well. There was no verbal answer, but the humming stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was even louder than the noise. It was a pressurized silence, the kind you feel in your ears just before a storm breaks. I pulled my hand away from the table, and that's when I noticed it. A single, wet footprint on the black and white tile. It was small, narrow, and headed toward the pantry. But the pantry door was shut, and the floor had been dry seconds ago. I stared at the print. It wasn't mine. I was wearing my hiking boots, and this print was from a bare foot, slender toes, a high arch. As I watched, a second print appeared, then a third. They were forming in real time, one after the other, marching toward the pantry door. But there was no one there to make them. It was as if an invisible woman was walking across my kitchen, her feet wet from the phantom torrent of water I had heard earlier. The footsteps reached the pantry door and stopped. I held my breath, waiting for the latch to click. I waited for the door to swing open, but nothing happened. The kitchen remained a tomb of shadows and dust. I walked over to the prints, kneeling down to touch the damp tile. The water was real. It was cold and smelled faintly of salt like seawater. But we were miles from the coast, tucked deep into the heart of the mountains. I stood up and approached the pantry. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle. I expected it to be locked, but it turned with a light, airy click. I pulled it open, empty, just rows of bare wooden shelves covered in a fine layer of gray silt. There was no one inside, and no way out. But then, the lag caught up. Behind me, in the middle of the empty kitchen, I heard the sound of a woman's bare feet stepping on tile. Slap, 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 slap. The sound was moving away from the pantry now. It was heading back toward the foyer. I spun around, but the kitchen was empty. The wet footprints were already starting to evaporate, disappearing into the tile as if they had never been there. I followed the sound of the footsteps into the hallway. I didn't want to follow them, but it was as if my curiosity had been hooked by a wire, pulling me deeper into the house's twisted logic. The hallway was a long, dark throat. The only light came from the moon, which had begun to peek through the high, arched windows. I walked slowly, my own boots making no sound at all now. The house had decided to stop echoing me entirely. It was only interested in the other one, the one with the bare, wet feet. I followed the slap-slap of the footsteps until they stopped at the base of the grand staircase. I looked up. The staircase spiraled into the darkness of the second floor. The footsteps started again, but they were different now. They were heavier, slower, as if the person making them was carrying something. Or someone thud-slap, the sound of a body being dragged up the wood. I gripped the banister, the old varnish smooth under my palm. I felt a vibration in the wood, a rhythmic tapping coming from above. The tapping was deliberate. 3 short hits, 3 long, 3 short SOS. Someone was signaling from the floor above. But as I looked up, I realized the sound wasn't coming from the second floor landing. It was coming from higher up, from the ceiling of the hallway itself. There was a small, rectangular hatch in the plaster, nearly hidden by the shadows. A pull string dangled just out of reach, swaying gently in a draft I couldn't feel. The string swayed with a hypnotic rhythm. It was a simple braided cord, yellowed by age, ending in a dusty wooden bead. Every time the tapping started short, the string would dance, as if the person above was punctuating their plea for help with a pull. I reached up, my fingers brushing the cold air, but I was inches too short. I needed something to stand on. I looked back toward the kitchen, but the hallway seemed to have grown longer. The distance back to the kitchen felt immense. The shadows between the doors were deeper, like pools of ink waiting to catch my ankles. I didn't want to turn my back on the hatch. I felt that if I looked away, the string would disappear, or worse, something would reach down and grab it first. I found a small, sturdy stool in the parlor nearby. It was covered in a heavy velvet cloth that felt like moss under my touch. I dragged it toward the hatch. The sound of the stool dragging screech was deafening in the silence. I waited for the house to play it back. I counted to 10, 20, nothing. The house was no longer interested in my noises. It was as if I had become a silent observer in a world that only valued the sounds of the dead. I placed the stool directly beneath the swaying cord. My heart was a drum in my chest, a frantic beat that I could feel in the tips of my fingers. I stepped onto the stool. It groaned under my weight, a low, complaining sound that seemed to travel down into the foundation. I reached up again. My fingers closed around the wooden bead. It was warm, just like the door in my dream. The bead felt like it had been held in a closed palm for hours. The moment I touched it, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was so absolute that I could hear the blood rushing through my own veins. I hesitated. Every instinct I had, every ounce of common sense, told me to step down, walk out the front door, and never look back. But there was a gravity to this house, a pull that made the idea of leaving feel impossible. I closed my eyes and pulled the cord. I expected a loud, metallic snap. Instead, the hatch opened with a soft, sighing sound, like a final breath leaving a pair of lungs. A folded wooden ladder began to descend. The ladder didn't drop. It unfolded slowly, the joints moving with a fluid-oiled precision. As it touched the floor, a cloud of fine, white dust billowed out, smelling of ancient cedar and something sweet, like pressed flowers. I looked up into the opening. It wasn't pitch black. There was a faint, bluish glow coming from the edges of the attic, like the light of a television left on in a dark room. But there was no electricity up there. I climbed the first rung. The wood was solid, far stronger than it looked. As my head passed through the plane of the ceiling, the temperature dropped 20 degrees. It wasn't just cold. It was a biting, dry chill that made my eyes water. I pulled myself up onto the attic floor. It wasn't a crawl space. It was a finished room, filled with stacks of crates and old, framed mirrors leaning against the eaves. Every mirror was covered in black cloth. I stood in the center of the room, my breath visible in the strange, blue light. I looked for the source of the glow. It wasn't a lamp or a window. The light was coming from the floorboards themselves, leaking out from the cracks between the wood. I knelt down, pressing my ear to the floor. I didn't hear tapping anymore. I heard a heartbeat, slow, steady, thump, thump. It wasn't coming from below me. It was coming from inside the wood. I stood up quickly, my heart racing to match the rhythm I'd just heard. I turned toward the far corner of the attic, where a single chair sat facing a draped mirror. The humming started again. It was louder here, a rich, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate in my very teeth. The woman in the tan dress wasn't there, but the chair was rocking gently, as if someone had just stood up from it, and on the seat of the chair sat a single, wet boot. It was my boot, identical in every way to the ones I was wearing. The same scuff on the toe, the same frayed lace. I looked down at my own feet. I was wearing both of my boots. I reached out to touch the one on the chair, but as my hand got close, I heard a voice whisper directly into my ear. It didn't come from the room. It came from inside my own head. "Don't touch it," the voice said. "If you take the sound, you take the weight." The voice didn't sound like a stranger's. It sounded like my own, but stripped of all emotion, flat and hollow. I pulled my hand back from the boot, as if the air around it had turned to ice. I looked at the covered mirrors. There were dozens of them, of all shapes and sizes, leaning against the rafters like silent witnesses. Each one was draped in a heavy, black fabric that seemed to absorb the blue light leaking from the floor. I felt a strange, magnetic pull toward the largest mirror in the center of the room. It was an oval glass, nearly 6 feet tall. The fabric covering it was thicker than the others, held in place by a silver pin at the top. The humming was coming from behind the cloth now. It wasn't a lullaby anymore. It was a low, rhythmic chant, a single word repeated over and over, though I couldn't quite make out what the word was. "Who are you?" I whispered. I didn't expect the voice in my head to answer, and it didn't. But the humming behind the black cloth shifted. It became a mimicry of my own breathing. Every time I inhaled, the sound behind the mirror inhaled. Every time I held my breath, the room went silent. It was as if the mirror wasn't reflecting an image, but a soul. I reached for the silver pin, my pulse thundering in my ears. The pin was ice cold. As I pulled it free, the black fabric didn't fall. It slid off the glass like liquid, pooling on the floor in a dark, silent heap. I braced myself to see a monster, or a ghost, or even the woman in the tan dress. It didn't reflect the attic, the crates, or the blue light. It was a window into a different room. A room that looked exactly like my kitchen, but everything was reversed. In the reflection, I saw the oak table and the black and white tiles. But on the table sat a tea kettle that was steaming, even though I knew I had turned mine off. I leaned closer, my nose almost touching the glass. In the reflection, a hand reached out and grabbed the kettle. A hand with a small crescent-shaped scar on the thumb. I looked down at my own hand. I had the same scar from a childhood accident. I watched my own reflected hand pour the tea. But I wasn't moving. I was standing perfectly still in a freezing attic. Yet the me in the mirror was going about her evening in the kitchen below. She looked happy. She looked peaceful. Then, she stopped. She turned her head toward the camera toward me and her eyes went wide. She couldn't see me, but she could hear me. She tilted her head, listening to the sound of my heartbeat. The acoustic lag finally made sense. The sounds I was hearing weren't from the past. They were from her, the version of me living inside the house's memory. And the sounds she was hearing were from me. I was the ghost in her kitchen. I was the one making the floorboards creak and the water rush. I pressed my hands against the glass. It wasn't hard like a mirror. It was soft, yielding like the surface of a pond. "Help me," I said. The reflection didn't hear the words. She only heard a low, distorted groans, the same sound I had heard when I first entered the house. She backed away from the table, her face pale with terror. She grabbed a heavy iron fire poker from the hearth. I realized with a jolt of horror that I was watching the scene I had lived through just an hour ago, but from the perspective of the haunter. I tried to pull my hands away from the glass, but they were stuck. The mirror was drinking the warmth from my skin, pulling me forward. The blue light from the floorboards flared into a blinding white. The humming turned into a roar. I felt my feet leave the attic floor. I wasn't falling, I was being inhaled. The attic, the crates, and the covered mirrors began to dissolve into a swirl of gray mist and static. I closed my eyes and screamed. But the sound that came out of my mouth wasn't a scream. It was the sharp, melodic laugh I had heard earlier from the porch. I felt a sudden, violent jolt, and then nothingness. Just the sensation of falling through a deep, silent void where time had no meaning. When I finally opened my eyes, I wasn't in the attic anymore. I was standing in the foyer, holding a heavy skeleton key. The weight of the key in my hand was the only thing that felt real. It was biting into my palm, a cold, sharp reminder of where I was. But I had just been in the attic. I could still smell the dust and the pressed flowers. I looked down at my boots. They were bone dry. The wet footprints I had followed only minutes ago were gone. I was standing on the porch, the mist swirling around my ankles, as if I had just arrived for the very first time. A wave of nausea rolled over me. I reached out to touch the doorframe to steady myself. It felt solid, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that if I pushed hard enough, my hand would go right through it. I looked at the car parked in the driveway. My car. The engine was clicking as it cooled down. Everything was exactly the same, except for one thing: the silence. It wasn't the heavy, expectant hush from before. It was ... Then I turned the key. The lock yielded with that same soft, damp sound. I stepped inside, but I didn't drop my keys on the table this time. I kept them clenched in my fist. I waited, counting the seconds. 1, 2, 3, clink. The sound of keys hitting wood echoed from the foyer table. Even though my hands were empty, I stared at the bare mahogany surface. There was nothing there. But the sound was perfect. The house was playing a recording of my previous life. I backed away from the table, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. If the house was playing back my sounds, then it knew I was here. Or rather, it knew I had been here. I walked toward the kitchen, my movements stiff and robotic. Every step I took was silent. No creaks, no thuds. But exactly 4 paces behind me, the sound of heavy boots followed. Thud, thud, thud. It was the ghost of my arrival, catching up to the present. I reached the kitchen and stopped. I didn't turn on the tap. I didn't move a single chair. I simply sat on the floor in the center of the black and white tiles and waited. I wanted to see if the other sounds would start. The bare feet, the humming, the dragging. I sat there for what felt like an hour, watching the shadows of the pine trees stretch across the floor like long skeletal fingers. The sun was setting again, but it felt too fast. Time in the house was no longer a straight line. It was a fraying rope. As the light faded, I heard it, the humming. It started in the pantry, a low buzzing vibration that made my skin crawl. But it wasn't the motherly lullaby from before. It was distorted, like a radio station losing its signal. It was a series of pops and clicks, interspersed with a woman's voice saying a single word over and over. Wait, wait. I stood up, my legs shaking. I'm waiting, I shouted. My voice didn't echo. It didn't even leave my throat. It was as if the air in the kitchen had turned to a thick, viscous liquid that swallowed all vibration. I realized then that I wasn't just a ghost to the house anymore. I was becoming part of the insulation. I was being woven into the quiet. I ran for the foyer, desperate to reach the front door and see the sky. I grabbed the brass handle and pulled. It wouldn't budge. I turned the deadbolt, throwing my weight against the wood, but the door felt like it was part of the foundation itself. I looked through the narrow side window. My car was gone. In its place was a dense thicket of trees that looked like they had been growing there for decades. The road was gone. The gate was gone. The mist had turned into a solid white wall that pressed against the glass. I wasn't in the mountains anymore. I was somewhere else. A place where the house was the only thing that existed. I turned around and looked up the grand staircase. The attic hatch was open. The yellowed cord was swaying, even though there was no breeze. And then, the sound I had been dreading began. Creak, creak, creak. Someone was coming down the stairs. Not the wet, bare feet. These were heavy, deliberate steps. The steps of someone wearing boots. I hid behind the velvet-draped bench in the foyer, pulling my knees to my chest. I watched the landing through the wooden slats of the banister. A pair of boots appeared. They were scuffed at the toe. The laces were frayed. They were my boots. I looked down at my own feet. I was barefoot. My boots were gone, and the woman standing on the landing was wearing them. She was wearing my tan coat. She was holding my keys. And she was looking right at me. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to make myself as small as possible. The woman on the landing didn't move. She stood perfectly still, her face obscured by the deep shadows of the upper hall. She held my keys up, the metal glinting in the pale, sickly light. She began to shake them, jingle, jingle, jingle. It was the exact sound I had made when I first arrived. She wasn't just wearing my clothes. She was performing my history. Who are you? I tried to scream, but only a dry rasp left my throat. The woman didn't answer with words. Instead, she tilted her head to the side, mimicking my exact posture of fear. Then, she opened her mouth. The sound that came out wasn't a human voice. It was the sound of the car engine clicking as it cooled down. It was the sound of the gravel crunching. She was a vessel for every sound the house had stolen from me. She took a step down, then another. Her movements were jerky, like a marionette being operated by someone who didn't quite understand how joints worked. Every time her boot hit a step, the sound was delayed by exactly 3 seconds. She was living in the lag. I realized that if she reached the bottom of the stairs, she would be in the present with me. I couldn't let that happen. I scrambled toward the parlor, my bare feet silent on the cold floor. I slipped into the parlor and hid behind a heavy wing-back chair. The room was freezing, the air smelling of ozone and wet earth. I listened. I waited for the sound of her boots to follow me, but there was only silence. A long, suffocating silence that stretched until my ears began to ring. Then, from the hallway, I heard the sound of a match striking. A tiny flicker of light cast a long, dancing shadow against the parlor door. The shadow was wrong. It was the shape of a woman, but it had too many limbs. Or perhaps it was just the way the light hit the wall. The shadow grew larger as the light approached. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for the sun to rise, for the loop to break, for anything to make sense. But the light didn't come into the room. It stopped at the threshold. And then, I heard the humming. The lullaby was back, but this time, I could hear the words. Deep in the wood, the echo is grown. Take what is yours, and leave what is known. The voice was beautiful, a rich soprano that vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't the woman in the boots. It was coming from the walls themselves. The shadow at the door began to recede, moving back toward the stairs. I peeked around the chair. The hallway was empty, but a single, lit match was floating in the air, drifting upward toward the attic. I followed it. I didn't have a choice. The house was like a giant lung, and I was being inhaled toward the top floor once again. I climbed the stairs, my bare feet feeling the vibration of that phantom heartbeat in the wood. Thump, thump, thump. It was louder now, a frantic, panicked rhythm. I reached the landing and looked up at the attic hatch. The ladder was still down, but the blue light had turned a deep, bruised purple. I climbed the wooden rungs. My hands were numb, my breath coming in shallow gasps. As I reached the attic, I saw that the room had changed. The covered mirrors were no longer leaning against the walls. They were standing in a circle, facing inward toward the small wooden desk. The woman in the boots was sitting in the chair. Her back was to me. She was writing in the leather-bound book, the pen scratching against the paper with a violent intensity. "You took my boots," I whispered. This time, my voice was loud. It echoed off the mirrors, bouncing from glass to glass until it sounded like a choir of 1,000 women screaming the same sentence. The woman at the desk stopped writing. She didn't turn around. She slowly reached up and unpinned the tan coat she was wearing. She let it slide off her shoulders, revealing a simple tan dress underneath. The exact dress I had seen in the mirror. "I didn't take them," she said. Her voice was an exact match for mine, but it carried a weight of centuries. "You gave them to the house the moment you stepped across the threshold. You can't keep what you don't use." She turned the chair around. Her face wasn't a monstrous, it was mine. But her eyes were made of the same dark, silvered glass as the mirrors. "Now," she said, holding out the pen. "It's your turn to record the silence." I stared at the pen. It was a simple fountain pen, old and tarnished, but the nib was stained with an ink so black it looked like a hole in reality. My double held it out, her glass eyes reflecting the purple glow of the room. I didn't want to touch it. I knew that if I took that pen, I was accepting a contract I didn't understand. "What happens if I refuse?" I asked. My voice sounded tiny against the vast, humming silence of the attic. The woman the other tilted her head. "If you refuse, the sound stops," she whispered. "And when the sound stops, the house stops. Do you want to be frozen here forever? A statue in a room of covered mirrors?" She gestured to the circle of glass around us. I looked at the nearest mirror. The black cloth was gone. In the glass, I saw a version of myself standing in a garden I didn't recognize. She was laughing. She was alive. She was free. Is that me? I asked, stepping closer to the mirror. The woman in the glass couldn't see me, but she seemed to feel a chill. She rubbed her arms and looked toward the sky. My double stood up from the chair. That is the version of you that never turned the key, she said. The house didn't just take your sound, Elodie. It took your choice. Every time you make a noise in this house, you are feeding the loop. You are writing your own cage. I looked back at the leather-bound book on the desk. It was open to a page dated today. The handwriting was frantic, sprawling across the parchment. She is standing at the door. She is holding the iron poker. She is climbing the ladder. My heart stopped. Everything I had done since I arrived was already written down. Not in the past tense, but as an instruction. I wasn't living my life. I was performing a script that had been written by the woman before me. I flipped the page back, and another thousands of pages, all filled with the same repetitive cycle. Different names were crossed out at the top of each section, names I didn't recognize, but the actions were always the same. The arrival, the tea, the footsteps, the scream. I realized with a surge of horror that the woman in the tan dress wasn't a ghost. She was just the person who held the pen before I did. Who was the first? I demanded, turning to face my double. But she was gone. The chair was empty. The tan dress was crumpled on the floor like a shed skin. I was alone in the circle of mirrors. The purple light began to pulse, timed perfectly with the heartbeat in the floorboards, thump, thump, thump. The sound was so loud now that it made the mirrors rattle in their frames. The glass was starting to crack. I grabbed the pen. The moment my fingers touched the cold metal, a jolt of electricity shot up my arm, and the attic vanished. I wasn't in the dark anymore. I was standing in the middle of a crowded street in a city I had never been to. People were rushing past me, their voices a chaotic symphony of noise. But none of them looked at me. I looked down at my hands. I was holding a leather-bound book, and I was wearing a simple tan dress. The noise was a physical assault. Car horns, the screech of tires, thousands of overlapping conversations. After the pressurized silence of the house, it felt like my head was going to split open. I stood in the center of the sidewalk, a stationary rock in a river of people. I looked down at the leather-bound book in my hands. The ink on the page was dry, but a single line was beginning to form on its own. She stands in the crowd, drowning in the sound. The words appeared in my own handwriting, appearing letter by letter, as if an invisible hand were guided by my very thoughts. I tried to drop the book, to let it fall into the gutter, but my fingers wouldn't let go. It was as if the leather had fused with my skin. I wasn't just holding the record anymore. I was the needle on the record. I looked up, trying to find a street sign or a familiar landmark. But as I watched, the faces of the people passing by began to blur. Their features smoothed over like melting wax, leaving behind blank, featureless masks of skin. The sound didn't stop though. The voices continued, louder and more frantic, but they weren't coming from the people. They were coming from the buildings, the pavement, the air. Stop it, I yelled, but my voice was instantly swallowed by the roar of a passing bus. Except, it wasn't a bus. As it passed, I saw it was just a shell of metal and glass, empty of passengers, empty of a driver. The city was a stage set, a hollow imitation of life designed to generate enough noise to keep the book filled. I realized then that I hadn't escaped the house at all. The house had simply expanded its walls. I began to run. I pushed through the faceless crowd, my bare feet slapping against the concrete. Slap, slap, slap. The sound was delayed. 3 seconds. My own footsteps followed me, echoing off the glass skyscrapers. I turned a corner into a narrow alleyway, hoping for a moment of quiet, but the humming was there, too. It was vibrating through the brick walls, the same motherly lullaby from the kitchen. I leaned against a damp wall, gasping for air. I opened the book to the very back, past the jagged lines and the scripts of the previous owners. I found a map. It wasn't a map of the city, but a diagram of a human ear. In the center of the drawing, where the eardrum should be, was a tiny, detailed sketch of the house on the ridge. The house wasn't in the mountains. It was inside me. It was the center of my own perception. The silence is a choice, a voice whispered. It wasn't the double this time. It was a memory of my own voice from years ago, before I had ever received the will. I looked at the pen still clutched in my hand. If I was the one writing the script, then I was the one who could end it. I pressed the nib to the page, but I didn't write words. I began to black out the lines of the city. As the ink covered the words, "She stands in the crowd," the skyscraper in front of me began to dissolve into gray mist. I struck through the description of the noise, and the roar of the city dipped in volume. It was like turning a dial on a radio. I felt a surge of power, terrifying, cold adrenaline. I wasn't just a record keeper. I was the editor. I began to scribble over the pages with a violent, frantic energy. The more I erased, the more the world around me vanished. The faceless people flickered and winked out of existence. The pavement turned to soft earth. The smell of exhaust was replaced by the scent of ancient cedar and dried lavender. I was standing in a void, a white space where sound had no meaning. I looked down at the book. Only one page remained untouched, the page with the sketch of the house. And the name at the top. The name wasn't Elodie. It was a name I didn't recognize, yet it felt like a weight I had carried for 1,000 years. I reached for the silver pin that was now fastened to the collar of my tan dress. If I unpinned it, the veil would fall. I would see the house for what it really was. I took a deep breath, the air tasting of mountain fog. I pulled the pin. The white void shattered like a sheet of glass. The shattering wasn't loud. It was the sound of 1,000 mirrors falling onto a bed of velvet. When the shards settled, the white void was gone. I was back in the attic, but it was stripped bare. No crates, no clothes, no glowing floorboards. Just a circular room made of smooth, dark stone. In the center sat the desk, and behind it, a figure that looked like a shadow cast by a light that didn't exist. The figure didn't have a face, yet I felt its gaze like a physical heat. It wasn't the double. It was something older. It was the source of the heartbeat, the origin of the acoustic lag. I stood before it, the leather-bound book heavy in my arms. "I've erased the city," I said. My voice was no longer an echo. It was solid. It was mine. The shadow leaned forward, and the room began to vibrate with a low, sub-bass hum. "You haven't erased anything," the shadow whispered. The voice didn't come from its mouth. It came from the stone walls, the floor, and the very air I was breathing. "You've only simplified the canvas. You wanted to know who was first, Elodie, but you're asking the wrong question. You should be asking who is listening." I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. The heartbeat in the floor accelerated. I looked at the final page of the book again. The name at the top was pulsing with a faint, rhythmic light. It wasn't a name at all. It was a frequency, a string of numbers and symbols that looked like a radio coordinate. "This house is a beacon," the shadow continued. "It gathers the echoes of lives that are too loud to go unnoticed. It isn't a prison. It's a filter. And you are the current that runs through it." The shadow reached out a hand made of smoke. It pointed to the book. "Every time a resident screams, every time they run, every time they realize the loop, the signal grows stronger. The city you saw was just a test of your volume. You were too quiet, Elodie. You didn't fight back enough. So the house had to turn up the tension." I realized with horror that my fear wasn't a reaction to the house. It was the house's fuel. "If my fear is the fuel, then I choose not to be afraid," I said, though my heart was betraying me. The shadow laughed, a sound like dry leaves skittering across stone. "It's too late for choice. You've already written the ending. Look at the last page." I turned to the very end of the book. There was a drawing of me. But it wasn't me in the attic. It was me back on the mountain road, sitting in my car, looking at the iron gates. The drawing was so detailed I could see the steam rising from the car's hood. I could see the expression on my own face, a mixture of hope and exhaustion. I was about to step out. I was about to start the cycle. "That's not me," I whispered. "I'm here. I'm in the attic." The shadow tilted its head. "Time is a flat circle for the ear, Elodie. You are hearing the beginning of your arrival at the same time you are living the end." Suddenly, the sound of gravel crunching erupted in the room. Crunch, crunch. It was the sound of my boots from segment 3. The shadow began to fade, its form dissolving into the dark stone of the walls. "The cycle doesn't end when you leave," it said, its voice growing distant. "It ends when you become the silence, when you stop reacting, when you stop being a sound worth recording." The stone room began to shrink. The walls were closing in, the ceiling lowering until I was forced to my knees. The heartbeat was so loud now it was the only thing I could feel. I clutched the book to my chest. I had one more chance to use the pen. I didn't try to erase the house. I didn't try to erase the shadow. Instead, I turned to the drawing of me in the car, and I drew something in the passenger seat. I drew a small, silver bell. It was a nonsensical object, a detail that didn't belong in the script. The moment the ink hit the paper, the attic walls vanished. I wasn't in the stone room. I was back in my car. The engine was clicking as it cooled. The iron gates were in front of me. I reached for the door handle, my heart pounding. But then, from the passenger seat, I heard a sound that hadn't been there before. The sound was tiny, a delicate ting that sliced through the heavy mountain silence. I looked at the passenger seat. There it was, a small silver bell with an ornate handle. It was the glitch I had drawn into the script. The house knew how to record screams, footsteps, and heartbeat. Those are the sounds of fear. But it didn't know what to do with a clear, purposeless note of a bell. It was a sound without an echo. I picked it up. The metal was cool and solid. I didn't look at the house on the ridge. I knew that looking at it gave it power. I knew that acknowledging the shadows made them real. I stepped out of the car and rang the bell. Ting. The sound was instant. There was no 3-second lag. The air around the car seemed to ripple, the mountain fog tearing away like cheap paper to reveal a bright, blue sky. I walked toward the iron gates, but I didn't use the key. I took the leather-bound book and laid it on the gravel. "You want to record?" I whispered. "Then record this." I began to ring the bell in a frantic, irregular rhythm. It wasn't a code. It wasn't SOS. It was pure, random noise. I watched the ink in the book begin to vibrate, the jagged lines blurring until they became a solid, meaningless smear of black. The house reacted with a violent groan. The windows rattled, and the purple light flared behind the glass. The acoustic lag tried to catch up, playing back my bell rings 5 seconds later, then 10. But I didn't stop. I kept ringing, adding my own laughter to the mix. Real, genuine laughter. The house couldn't feed on joy. It only understood the friction of terror. The walls began to settle, the wood creaking in protest. I took the fountain pen and, instead of writing a new script, I signed my name across the very first page of the book. Not the frequency the shadow wanted, but my own name, Elodie, as the ink dried. The bond between my mind and the attic snapped. The weight in my chest vanished. I felt the transparency in my hands fade away, replaced by the warm, solid reality of my own skin. I was no longer a frequency. I didn't run. I walked calmly back to my car. I didn't look back to see if the house turned into a ruin or stayed a mansion. It didn't matter. By reclaiming my name and my noise, I had made myself invisible to the echo chamber. I was a dead frequency to the house now. It couldn't see me, because it couldn't hear me. I turned the engine over, and the car roared to life with a beautiful, messy, instant sound. As I drove down the mountain pass, the road stayed solid. The trees didn't blur. The sun stayed in the sky, moving at the pace a sun should move. I reached the main highway and saw a gas station. A real person was standing by the pump, washing a windshield. He looked up and waved. He had a face. He had eyes that weren't made of glass. I pulled over, my hands shaking not with fear, but with the sheer relief of being loud again. I walked into the station and bought a cup of coffee. The bell of the shop door rang as I entered. Ding. I stood there, waiting for the leg. 1, 2, 3. Nothing happened. The sound stayed in the past where it belonged. I laughed, a short, sharp sound that made the cashier smile. "Good morning," he said. His voice was his own. It wasn't a recording. It wasn't a mimicry. It was just a man, in a moment, in the real world. I got back in my car and looked at the passenger seat. The leather-bound book was gone. The silver bell was gone. The only thing left was the simple tan dress I had been wearing in the attic, folded neatly into a small square. I didn't throw it away. I put it in the trunk. It was a reminder that I had been to the edge of the silence and found my way back. I put the car in gear and headed toward the city. They say that silence is golden, but they're wrong. Silence is a predator. It's the noise of the world, the messy, unscripted, beautiful chaos of living that keeps us real. My name is Elodie, and I am no longer an echo. I am the voice, and for the first time in a long time, the only person listening is me. I rolled down the windows, turned up the radio, and let the wind scream past my ears. I was finally home.